Welcome to the Marconi Project, an oral history series of the Italian American Museum of Washington, D.C. In these interviews, we capture the memories and experiences of Italian immigrants and Italian Americans in the nation's capital. We are ready to hear your story.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that. Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate it. It makes up for the fact that the ad that you put in the program didn't mention my name. So you made up for it. Good job. Thank you. I pulled out a piece of paper. It's just one piece. Don't have that give you any false sense of security that this is going to be a short speech. These are just some notes. At the top of the page, I write two letters. And I write those two letters in every speech. When I did 29 presidential debates over my life, I would go up on stage and first thing to do is write these two letters. And the two letters are HS. And because every time I get up before an audience, I say a prayer to the Holy Spirit. And I ask the Holy Spirit to speak through me. And so I say that because if you don't like what I have to say, take it up with him, not with me. I want to thank you for honoring me. I guess I have to first and foremost thank Lido Germanio. I don't know how much it cost you, Lido, to rig the deal for me to get the nomination, but maybe after this speech it'll cost you more. I want to clarify something. Father Scalia came up to me and abused me before I came on stage here tonight, and charitably. And I get this all the time, which is Santorum. How's that Italian? And how was it changed? Who changed what? And how many of you thought that? Come on, how many of you sort of think, yeah, of course, right? I get it. I'm the only guy that ran for office whose father was born in Italy, who nobody knew I was Italian, right? And in Pennsylvania, where I ran, that was a big deal. I mean, there were a lot of Italians in Pennsylvania, and the vast, vast majority of them were Democrats who never knew I was Italian. It was very frustrating. But the reality is, give you some clue, my dad, Aldo Luigi, okay? My grandfather, Pietro, and my grandmother, Maria, Santorum, all came from a little town in northern Italy and called Riva del Garda, okay? It's on Lake Garda, up in the northern part of Italy. And I really get my Italian from that family. I never knew, I asked them about the Santorum because it always frustrated me that we weren't Italian enough. And they never gave me a good answer. I have been visited there. There are lots of Santorums who are not related to me. There's a whole page in the Riva phone book of Santorums. Never find any anywhere else, but in that town there's a bunch of them. Until one day I was having a conversation with a cardinal from Philadelphia, Cardinal Anthony Bevilacqua, Italian, who said to me, he said, you have a beautiful name. I said, well, yeah, if you're not running for office, it's a great name, but if you're running for office, it's not that great. And he said, he said, you don't know how your name came about? I said, no. He said, well, I do. I'm like, okay, I'll be charitable, I'll listen. And so he says, I'm certain this is what happened. He said, your great ancestor was a bastard. And I said, I'm sure he had some good qualities. And he said, no. He said, your great ancestor was born out of wedlock. And at a time when that happened with a woman who was born out of wedlock and the family couldn't take care of the child, they would take the child to the local monastery or convent. And they would bring the child to the convent. They would go to the gate. They would ring a bell, they'd put the baby in a turnstile, turn the turnstile over, and the monk or the sister would take it, and they would name the baby, his last name, the surname would be the saint of the day, De Stefano, D'Antonio, etc. He said, your relative was dropped off on All Saints Day. And because it was a high holy day, they would not use the vernacular, they would use the Latin, Santorum, of the saints. So you are honoring, fill in the blank. So that's not, look, my grandfather, my mom, her father was the first of his family to be born in the United States. He was from, my great-grandfather was from Parma. Not surprisingly, my grandfather eventually ended up running a restaurant down in Florida, but I didn't grow up in Florida, I grew up in Pennsylvania. So I didn't see my other side of the family, if you will. My grandmother on that side died when I was young. So the family I got to see and really notice was the family that was nearby. My grandfather came over in 1923, and he came over and found his way to a little town outside of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And he was a coal miner, and the town was named Tyre Hill. And let me be honest with you, the name does it more justice than Tyre Hill. It was a town, it was a coal town. My grandfather lived in a company town, got paid with stamps to shop at the company store. He worked his way, in fact, he worked in the coal mines, in the deep mines in western Pennsylvania for 30 years. When I went there and visited him, he had a house right on the main road in Tyre Hill, across from the office, the road across from the coal office. I would play in the backyard at that little house, and there would be two things. There would be a little backyard, and then there was a creek. And I was a kid. I mean, I was a little kid. I didn't know it, but the creek was orange. The water was orange from acid mine runoff. And I would notice that when someone flushed the toilet in one of the houses along the way, that ended up in the creek too. Right behind there was a bridge that went over the creek, and the bridge, within maybe here to there, were train tracks, electrified lines that took coal cars into the coal mines. And my parents let me play in the creek, and I walked on the tracks, went into the mine. I mean, Children Youth Services would be all over my parents today, right? But that was the town we grew up in. That was the town that I would visit. And I would go there once a month because my dad said, you're going to come and visit your grandparents every month. And I was a kid. I mean, I didn't want to go visit my grandma. I didn't want to be in this little town. I knew nobody, and, you know, ugly place, sort of like Appalachia. And I would go there, and Friday nights we'd have bacala or fried fish. And on Saturday, remember we're northern Italians, we'd have polenta, maybe risotto, and then what my grandmother called poutine. I don't know where that comes from, but it was like gravy with mystery meat in it. And they said it was beef sometimes, but I know it was squirrel and rabbit and anything my grandfather would shoot. Yeah, he was that kind of guy. He was an amazing man. And my grandfather they came to this country in 1923 after fighting in the First World War on the other side. And he saw Mussolini come to power, and he said, I'm out of here. I'm not going through this again. So he came here by himself. And he worked 7 years in the mines until he earned his citizenship and he could bring the rest of the family over. My dad came in 1930, not speaking a word of English, into this company town. And my grandfather worked until he was almost 70 years old. He had black lung. He smoked cigars, pipes, cigarettes, everything you could possibly imagine. He smoked these little cigars that looked like tree bark. But he was as tough as nails. And he taught me a lot. And one of the things that I remember most, again, I can think back to all those weekends that I spent there, and I can't remember any weekend that I wasn't there from my childhood. They made an impression on me. They sort of helped form me as to who I am. I wrote a book back in 2014 called Blue Collar Conservative after I ran for president in 2012. And when I announced for president in 2012, I announced about 15 miles from where my grandfather entered the mines. And I remember very clearly what I said that day because I remember having been now in proximity to him. The last time I saw him was when he passed away. And I went up to his casket and I knelt down. I was 16 years old maybe. I knelt down next to his casket. And you know, you're looking at the casket's like right here, so you're looking sort of down a little bit. And I couldn't take my eyes off his hands. He had enormous hands. He had sausages for fingers. It was amazing. And in these fingers folded like that was a rosary. Because my grandparents prayed the rosary. My grandmother always prayed the rosary. My grandfather would occasionally pray the rosary. And I looked at those hands, gnarled, rough, meaty, and all I could think was, those hands clawed their way to freedom for me. He made that sacrifice. So I could be running for president of the United States within a generation. What an amazing man. What an amazing country. He instilled in me the values that I hold today. And then as you heard from Elizabeth, that I try to instill in my children. With a more than 80% help from my wife, Karen. I feel incredibly blessed to be an Italian, an American, and a person of faith. And I want to talk about faith because every Sunday at the end of our visit before we left, we would go to church. My grandfather owned a suit, and he wore it every single Sunday to Mass. And so did we have to wear a suit to Mass. And we went to Mass, and it was the central part of what our family was about. We were Italians, and Italians were Catholics. When I was growing up, 90% of Italian Americans were Catholic. 92 when I was born. It's now under 50%. And what has happened to those 50%? Well, a lot of them are younger. But the vast majority of the folks who left the church are nuns. Not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S. They have left the faith. And so I sit here and I look, and a lot of folks here have gray hair in this room. And I have to take stock about, well, what did we do? You see, my grandparents made me go to church every Sunday and modeled for me what the Catholic Church was about. And you can say, well, I tried to do the same. And I believe you. I believe you. Because I felt the same way, because I would try to do the same thing too, and I realized, you know what? My parents and grandparents had it easy. The world that they grew up in was a world where society basically agreed with their values. I remember when I was a kid, if I strayed and did something wrong, the neighbor dad would set me straight, and my dad would come and say thank you. That doesn't happen anymore. I'd turn on the television and I would see things on television that actually supported the values that my parents were teaching me. That doesn't happen anymore. My parents didn't have to deal with these. These is a loaded gun at the mental health of your children. Now, I can understand that most of you probably didn't realize that because you're not as tuned into what this world is as they are. But this is like giving a 13-year-old the keys to your Ferrari and saying, have fun. It isn't going to end well. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? It's not ending well. It's not ending well for us as Italian Americans. You say, well, this is true for the world. This is true for everybody. Here's the difference. See, we're Italians, and Italians are not just any group of Catholics. We are the group of Catholics. 82% of the popes in the 2,000-year history of the church have been Italians. This is our faith. Ethnically. Yeah. The Irish, Poles. How many Irish popes have there been? Okay, yeah, there's a Polish pope. But that was 2,000 years before we got a Polish pope. Okay? The reality is, your culture is Catholic culture because Italians helped make that culture, make this church. For us to leave this church is like abandoning not just your faith, but it's abandoning your whole identity as an Italian. We have an obligation as Americans. And I talk about this all the time. I go around, and Gary was just at a dinner last week where I talk to groups about the state of this country, and it's not great. And what we reflect here in the Italian American community, you can say in every other community, things are really not great. And by the way, they're no better, actually somewhat worse in many respects in Italy itself. Because they're being governed by the EU, unfortunately for them, which is even more woke than some of the folks who are purveying the kind of things that institutions in this country purvey. The reality is that if you want to keep an Italian-American club going, you have to have an ecosystem in which it can live. There was an interesting interview I saw in April of this year by a guy named Richard Dawkins. You may or may not know who Richard Dawkins is. He's a biological evolutionist in the UK, very famous. He's also most known for his staunch atheism. And he was being interviewed, and he was asked the question, what do you think about, aren't you encouraged by the fact that almost half of young people in the West are atheists? And he said, that's great. He said, I'm really pleased to see that they're thinking clearly. And then he said, but I do have concerns. He says, we need to live, and I like living in a Christian culture. Because a Christian culture is decent. A Christian culture is beautiful. And I want to live in a Christian culture. And the obvious thing is, well, how can there be a Christian culture if there are no Christians? And how can you be an Italian if there is no church? It's the same question. We have an obligation. And I love the fact that you have a priest here and a priest there. And I love the fact that saying the benediction and the invocation. And a great one I might add, Father Scalia is a friend and amazing. And by the way, as an aside, if you haven't seen Father Scalia's eulogy for his dad at his father's funeral mass, it is epic. And something to remember when you think about a great man and what makes that man great. You're an organization that promotes education, as well you should. But what education are you promoting? My kids, they're amazing. Again, my wife homeschooled our children all through grade school. She's a nurse, neonatal intensive care nurse, a lawyer. She gave up both to create her magnus opus. 7, 8, with our son Gabriel, who's in heaven. Amazing children. All, thanks be to God, lovers of the church and the Lord. Well, I was blessed. We were blessed. Elizabeth talked about our daughter Bella. But before our daughter Bella was our son Gabriel. Our son Gabriel was born in 1996. It's a long story, and I'll shorten it to this. He was born premature and only lived 2 hours. It was the worst day of my life, having him born and survive. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning when he was born, and so I was able to baptize him and hold him. For the 2 hours he lived. We always say that he had a beautiful life. He knew nothing but love his entire life. It was painful, but it taught us an amazing lesson. That in the end, all that matters is the end. That's why I tell my kids that you're going to be forgotten. I'll be forgotten. Yes, Donald Trump will be forgotten. It's just a matter of time. Name 10 emperors of Rome. We're all going away. What matters is what lasts. And what lasts is eternity. And if you don't know why you're here, let me fill you in. One of 2 reasons. You're here because of Richard Dawkins' evolutionary crapshoot that somehow out of nothing came this, by chance. Time and the application of natural law. And you're just an accident. That's one scenario. The only other scenario is you were created by a loving God to do one thing. Love him and be with him for eternity. And he gives you the choice to decide what to do. That's why you're here. I figured that out when my son passed away. And yes, Bella made me a better father, but Gabriel made me a father in the first place. You've got a mission, and it's an important one. And that's to help rear and educate young people, young Italian-American kids. Teach them the truth. Guide them to the truth. I told my kids they can go to, Karen and I agreed, my kids could go to any college they wanted to go to. But here are the 28 we'll pay for. It's amazing how rational your children can be. I would just encourage this organization to think about giving scholarships to schools that are going to rip kids' faith out within 4 years. And whether we're really helping those children by sending them to those schools. It's a dangerous world out there. I know cop shows used to say it all the time. It was Hill Street Blues, remember? And be careful, it's dangerous out there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is dangerous out there. And it's not dangerous because someone might take your life. It's someone might rip the soul out of one of your children. We have to be more vigilant. We have to do something that you never thought you'd have to say to a group of Italians, which is you've got to fight for the souls of your children. You can't take it for granted anymore. And so I just want to thank you for honoring me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you about things that I think are big things, important things. We are blessed to be Americans. One of my favorite verses on with this, which is in the Catholic Bible, it says, to whom much is given, much is expected. To whom more is given, more is required. I don't know about you, but we live in the richest country at the richest time in the history of the world. If we aren't that second part of that, if we aren't the ones who more has been given to, I don't know who is. We have a high bar to cross for that eternity. I just feel every time I get a chance to get in front of a group, I just need to remind you. That day's coming. Death, judgment, heaven, hell. I just want to be part of saying, let's make the right choice, not just for you, but for your children, and for all the things that this club and that we all believe in. It's worth it. It's worth the fight. It's worth the sacrifice. I can tell you, I am someone who's fought a lot of battles and probably 95% of the time lost them. But I will tell you this, God has blessed me more in my losses than in any victory I ever had. And I know in your own life, it's the same way. Yeah, we remember our victories, but the losses are what makes us who we are. Don't be afraid of losing. Fight. God bless you.